Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to begin. Thank you.
गणनायकं गजमुखं वक्रतुण्डं वक्रतुण्डं विनायकं गणनायकं गजमुखं वक्रतुण्डं विनायकं गणनायकं गजमुखं वक्रतुण्डं विनायकं मङ्गलं सुखदायकं मङ्गलं सुखदायकं कलाधिपो त्वं गणनायकं गणनायकम्
गणानां गणपति गणेश लंबोदर सूर्य भुजाचार एकदंत चंद्रमा ललाट राजे ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश कालदि गुरुपद गावे अति विचित्र गणनाथ आज मृदंग बजावे मयूरेश्वरं च वरदं मल्लाळ तुष्टिप्रदं बीजात्मकं विघ्नान्तकं सिद्धीश्वरं गजमुखं वन्दे गणाधिपं विभुं शिवसुतं गुणनिधीश्वरं विघ्नेश्वरं विजयदं गुणनिधिं नमाम्यहं नमाम्यहं नमाम्यहं।
Good morning and a very warm welcome to our chief guests, Dr. Swapan Dasgupta and Shri Vijay Gokhale, and to you, our discerning audience. I, Mohini Karkarey, am honored to walk you through the launch of yet another masterpiece by Dr. Vijay Gokhale. We have with us today luminaries from the Defense Forces, eminent historians, and distinguished personalities from all walks of life, as well as the honorable descendants of the Sardar Gharanas and their families. I welcome you all. We began by garlanding the statue of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj by our chief guests, and now invoking Lord Ganesh and seeking his blessings for this occasion, not only because he is the Arya Devata of our Maharashtra, but also he was that of Madhavrao Peshwa. The performance was the Samarchana School of Dance. I now request Dr. Uday Kulkarni and Mr. Amit Paranjape to accompany Dr. Swapan Dasgupta and Shri Vijay Gokhale, our chief guests, to grace us with their presence on stage. इतिहास के पन्नों में खोए भी हैं और नज़र भी आए, यहाँ मौजूद हम सबके पूर्वज, इसी मिट्टी में पले बड़े हुए, जहाँ हम खुशहाल जिंदगी अब जी रहे हैं। उनके ज़मीर, धैर्य, शौर्य, स्वराज से साम्राज्य के सपने और उनकी पूर्ति को शत शत प्रणाम। Thank you, gentlemen. I now request Uday Kulkarni to felicitate Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. I request Amit Paranjape to felicitate Sri Vijay Gokhale. The much-awaited launch of the book, The Mastery of Hindustan, Triumphs and Travails of Madhavrao Peshwa, arrives in a palki, accompanied by the Tutari artist, Mr. Janardhan, who has come all the way from Satara. The Peshwa trilogy, comprising of era of Bajirao, the extraordinary epoch of Nanasaheb Peshwa, and Mastery of Hindustan, the entire period from 1707 to 1772, a limited collector's edition, will also be unveiled today. Ladies and gentlemen, please. I request our chief guest to unveil the book. We will now unveil the trilogy too. A single thread is all it takes for a weaver to begin his masterpiece. He then adds a myriad of colors, shades, and hues to complete his work. The same can be said of Uday Kulkarni. It doesn't take the reader much time before he finds himself transported in the period of the book. The characters come alive. The land traveled can be visualized. Such is the depth of his writing style. Uday not only taps the resources of written material, but also treads the paths walked and lived by the characters in his books. His mantra is, climb every mountain, follow every lead. And sure enough, he finds all that he seeks, penning it down for us to absorb. Here, I must add that his wife, Dr. Medha Kulkarni, accompanies him unflinchingly through this journey, whether the road be rough or smooth. Just as he unfolds the layers as a surgeon with his scalpel, the same precision is seen in his writings. Just as the weaver presents his masterpiece, so does Uday, bringing to the reader a complete factual representation of the period. This is his 7th book, and I am sure the idea of the next has already taken birth. Uday does not write biographies. I quote, "The book is a macro history of the times, but it is also a micro history of each event that occurred, the slow dance of time as it meandered through the lives of men who sought power, wealth, freedom, and greatness." I unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Uday Kulkarni.
Thank you, Mohini, for raising the bar and making it that much more difficult for me. And thanks all of you for spending this very nice Sunday morning with me. And I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Now, the feeling before a launch of a book is like the father-to-be who's pacing outside the delivery room. And I've gone through all those pangs in the last couple of hours. And now that the baby is delivered, I can take a breath and carry on with the rest of the program. Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, Shri Vijay Gokhale, Amit Paranjape, Mohini, and my friends who are all assembled here. So, the book is a culmination of several months, probably years of work. Each book is practically like a dissertation in itself. And this one is a book which I actually planned to write in 2012 when I finished my first book, which was The Solstice at Panipat, the campaign of Panipat, Third Battle of Panipat. At that time, Ninad Bedekar, the late historian, was the one I came in contact with. And he told me that you should not write of the period after Panipat. I want you to go back and start from the beginning of the 18th century, write about Baji Rao first. That is what led me to writing about the next book, which was the era of Baji Rao. And then came the extraordinary epoch of Nana Sahib Peshwa, and then this book, The Mastery of Hindustan. Actually, these 3 books encompass what is called the main Peshwai period, because from Balaji Vishwanath Peshwa to Madhavrao Peshwa is the period of the 4 principal Peshwas. And the period after Madhavrao, within a few months after his death, is what we call the Uttar Peshwai, because practically from that time onwards, the Peshwa was really not much in control of what was happening in the kingdom. It was the ministers or the generals who were actually participating in the military campaigns as well as the administration. So, in a way, it happened that I wrote those books. Otherwise, by now I would have finished the story till 1818. In a way, it was a good thing because it is said that before you write history, you must cross the age of 50. And you must be older you are, the better it is. Like we say in medicine, before you hand the cup of knowledge to your student, he should wait for the froth to settle down. So I've very often found that people in their 20s and 30s tend to get excited when they read about history. Well, what is required is something quite the opposite. Now, today we have a very knowledgeable audience here. I'm fully aware of it. After all, we are all Punekars. And that gives us an inherent kind of advantage in the area of knowledge. And still, I will spend a few moments to recap the story until this book. The Maratha Power. I call it the first indigenous empire after several centuries, 5 or 6 centuries of alien rule, because Turco-Persian rule, for all the ways you try to put a gloss on it, finally remains foreign rule. Persian was the foreign language of the court, and the traditions, the religious policies of the rulers, they were all foreigners. And the first indigenous empire which came after so many centuries was the Maratha Empire, and that is its importance in our history. At the same time, it was the last indigenous empire before the British took over. So if you look back on the last 1,000 years of our history, and if you, as a nationalist, I'm wearing cap of a nationalist, not a historian now, you want to look back and feel proud about it, this is the period which you have to look at, the 17th and the 18th centuries. Now, it was Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, actually, in spite of the innumerable difficulties at that time, that he established a Swarajya against great odds. And the reason for that is that this freedom was necessary from social, economic, and religious oppression. All these 3 which were there, whether it was the Bahmani kingdoms or the Mughals, all of them practiced it in some form or the other. And the original constitution of the Maratha state, if you see, was centralized. It was a central power. The army was paid from the central treasury. The king was supreme. Unfortunately, after his death, and especially after the death of his son, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, you find that a massive invasion of the Mughals came into Maharashtra, and this centralized constitution of the Maratha state was disturbed, and that is why people later on started calling it the Maratha Confederacy. It was not possible for one king sitting deep south in Jinji to control all the constituent sardars who practically were autonomous and kind of took control of whatever was happening in their regions. And that later on, after the release of Chhatrapati Shahu, after 18 long years in Mughal prison, when he came back here, a sort of delegation of duties was already in place. And it was in that period that you find that most of the military campaigns as well as the administrative duties were done either by the Peshwa or the other chiefs or the other people who were appointed by him. And that is why this period after 1713 is known popularly as the Peshwai. Now, the momentum which was acquired by the Marathas in this long 25-year-old war against the Mughals actually carried them across the Narmada, across the Vindhyas into the north. And in 1719, just 12 years after the death of Aurangzeb, you find them appearing in Delhi with a 30,000 strong army. And within another 17 years, you find Bajirao Peshwa knocking on the doors of Delhi, telling Muhammad Shah to cede the province of Malwa to him, which happened a few years later. In 1739, Nadir Shah came, and the Mughals, whatever there were left, was kind of vanquished during that time. And you find from 1747-48, Ahmad Shah Abdali began his invasions of India, which continued till 1769, 9 invasions that were from Afghanistan. And as the Mughals progressively became both timid and weak, they had to depend on the only power in India which could protect them as well as the frontiers of India, which were at that time the Marathas. And this was actually the first inkling you have of a political India, of a power deep in the south, in the Deccan, going north and defending the boundaries of the country in the northwest, and saying, like Raghunath Rao when he went to Attock, his armies went to Attock from Lahore, he wrote a letter to Nana Sahib Peshwa that the Shah of Iran has said that you attack Abdali from that side, I will attack him from here, and let us divide. I'll take Kandahar, you take Kabul. And Raghunath Rao writes to Nana Sahib, but why should we cede Kandahar to Iran? It has been part of India from the time of Alamgir. So this was the first enunciation, I would say, of a political boundary of India. Sadashirao Bhahu, when he goes to Panipat, he writes to Shuja-ud-Dawla that let us settle our issues here. Let us first get rid of the outsider. Our duty is to protect the Chagtai dynasty. The Chagtai dynasty was a puppet by that time. It was a phantom actually. But it was in the interest of the Marathas to allow them to reign while they ruled. That was the logic behind their moves. And this actually, you find, is what led to a huge army going north when Ahmad Shah Abdali came on his 5th invasion in 1759-60, and it was found that the Scindia's armies and the Holkar's armies that were in the north could not face up to it, and a huge army had to send from the Deccan to face this challenge, and that was the expedition of Panipat, which ended on 14th of January 1761. And though you may call Panipat a military defeat, one must note that immediately after the battle, Nana Sahib Peshwa had almost reached near Jhansi, and you find Abdali sending his wakils to him that let's have a treaty. He sent robes of honor to him, and the treaty negotiations continued for a fairly long time. And he told him that I hand over the management of the kingdom of India to you. And that is what he said when he went. Now that is the point when this book starts. Because from whichever point in the 18th century you look at it, this Battle of Panipat is the epochal end of, is the main central event, and that is kind of strikes you whenever you look at the history of that time. It is not because thousands of men were killed in battle or the non-combatants were massacred in their thousands after the battle, or it was basically because an entire phalanx of military and administrative leadership, it was like the Maratha state had been decapitated, which was lost. And that took time to fill up. And that letter which is there, that do moti galat, satais mohre gele, and the remaining, there is no count of how much has been lost. It is not just poetry. I mean, it is a stark letter which says, which lays out the tremendous loss which the Maratha state at the top had sustained. Sawalak, Bangdi Phutli, and all these sayings come up from that point of view. So, this book is actually the narrative of the rescue of an empire. during the time of Madhavrao Peshwa. I would also compare the Battle of Panipat with the Battle of Talikota, which took place when Vijayanagar was attacked by all the 5 Deccani Sultanates in 1565, almost 200 years earlier. Now what happened? The battle was lost by Vijayanagar, but immediately after that, their capital was completely demolished and destroyed, and they never came up after that. Now during the Battle of Panipat, during campaign of Panipat, it was a logistical nightmare to provide supplies 1500 kilometers from Pune. But after the battle was lost, because Pune was so far away, Abdali could not attack the capital and destroy Pune, and that gave the Marathas some time to survive in the aftermath of the Battle of Panipat. Not that the task was easy, because enemies, whether it was a Nizam, whether it was Hyder Ali, whether it was Shuja-ud-Dawla, all the Pas in the north, the Jat Pas, Najib-ud-Dawla, they all came pouncing in the Doab and they pushed the Marathas south of the Chambal. Here Nizam came marching on to Pune. He burned the city of Pune. 2/3 of the city of Pune was burnt in 1763. So all these things happened. And a 16-year-old boy, you find, Madhavrao, is appointed the Peshwa because we were living in a feudal world. It was from father to son inheritance. And you find that he has to face not just his external enemies. He has rivals in his own family, rivals for power. And this period of 2 years of tutelage, I would say, which he went through, was a big challenge. I've labeled it as the abyss in the first section of the book, which ended with the Battle of Rakshas Bhavan, which was when Madhavrao asserted himself. And there is a letter from Raghunath Rao to Gopika Bai, who was Nana Sahib's wife, that Chiranjeev amcha peksha adhik zali. My nephew has now become even greater than me. So it was not that, it was the determination, the clarity of thought, leadership by personal example, ability to keep powerful chiefs in line. These are things which saw Madhavrao emerge from the multiple challenges which he had ahead of him. He was the last of the 4 principal Peshwas, and he was the one who put the state before self. Actually, he practiced the adage, the buck stops here. He enforced discipline, he audited powerful satraps. There are a lot of letters you find that my army is being audited, because the Saranjam says that you must maintain 5,000 troops, but they maintain only 4,000. So periodically there used to be audits of how many people have you maintained in your contingents. He introduced a strong judicial system. In fact, the name of Ram Shastri Prabhune is known today because he was encouraged by Madhavrao to become the Chief Justice. He created a fresh team of leaders. The entire phalanx of leaders which had been lost at Panipat was recreated in those 11 or 12 short years that Madhavrao was there. In his personal life, you cannot help be struck by the probity in personal life, in public affairs, the distinction between public and private funds, the strictness which he followed even when dealing with his family. There are several anecdotes about Parvati Bai, the widow of Sadashirao Bhau, saying that I want to see my ornaments, which were kept in the Jamdar Khana on Sivamagad. And when Madhavrao is away, Nana Fadnis gives it to her to have the look at the ornaments. Madhavrao writes a letter to Nana Fadnis, reprimanding him. Why have you given the ornaments to Parvati Bai? Now tell her that I have asked them to be kept back now that she has seen it, and they should be returned back to the Jamdar Khana. Or when his own wife, Rama Bai, asked for Vidyachi pans from Nana Fadnis, he said, when your husband is on a campaign, there is no need for you to do all this. Those days, pan was a way, when the lips got colored. So that is the kind of person we are dealing with here. So this required a closer study, and I hope I have done justice to it. But even then, this book is not a biography. It tells the story of a period, like all the other books that I have written so far, of which Madhavrao was the most important leader in the India of those times. Today it is uncommon to find a leader who puts India first, builds up her defense industries, advocates a Swachha Bharat. It's a very rare entity. The Middle Ages, India was still in a pre-nation state, and its national vision was still missing. But besides formulating policy and implementing it by example, Madhavrao also led armies into battle. Sadhya Ghodyane Swari Keli. On his horse he attacked the enemy. He himself personally led armies into battle. And if a person is putting ladders to climb a fort and take it, if the soldier was on the front topmost rung of the ladder, he would look down and find Madhavrao at the bottom rung. So that's the participation which Madhavrao had in his battles. Main adversary for Madhavrao was, of course, Hyder Ali in the south, because all his campaigns were towards the south. He defeated Hyder Ali almost 3 or 4 times in his time. However, there was a silent adversary whom he recognized, and that adversary, for whom he prepared, and that adversary was the English. And he has written in his letters, there's a letter which is titled The Foreign Policy of Madhavrao Peshwa, where he says, of all the topikars, the English are on the rise. He tells all his chiefs that they have captured all the forts from Masulipatnam and Calcutta to Surat, and they are the people whom you must beware of. And this is a macro policy, he says. But you find this man, when he's away on a campaign and there's a shortage of alloys, they use a alloy called pancharas for a foundry where they have to pour cannons. And he tells his minister, usually Nana Fadnis, that there is this cannon lying on Purandar fort, that cannon lying over there, which are all spoiled. So bring them, melt them, use that pancharas and pour fresh cannons. So he knows the names of the cannons, the place where the cannons are kept, and he's instructing his subordinates to get them from there and re-pour them and make fresh cannons. So it was not just the macro picture, he also had the micro picture in his mind when he was giving his orders to his ministers. Now, he also, of all the Peshwas, it was Nana Sahib and Madhavrao who also had a keen interest on the social and the religious milieu in which India at that time, the amount of construction which Nana Sahib, Bajirao before him and Madhavrao have done, it is not well documented, but if you go to Kashi tomorrow, anytime, and you go to the Dashashwamedh Ghat, at the path which goes down, you will find a big plaque saying that this ghat was built by Nana Sahib Peshwa. And Madhavrao was in his 9-point will which he left for his successors to achieve. 3 of those points deal with Kashi and Prayag. And it was only the Battle of Panipat, I would say, which prevented the Marathas from going east to Awadh and Allahabad, because those were the regions which they did not actually have under their control at all the time. And that is probably why these were the unfinished tasks of him, and he died prematurely before his 28th birthday. Many authors, from Grand Duff to Richard Temple to Govindrao Sardesai, they have all called him the greatest Peshwa. And when you read about his times, you really find it's a really an arguable proposition to label him as the greatest Peshwa. There is a short couplet in the ballad or a povada which describes the entire rule of Madhavrao. Eka chhatra karuni gele Madhavrao, thara thara kapat hote ashta umrao, basavele Hastanapur rajya Pachao is the Patsha, dadasi mokle kele rajya karao. Before he died, he left Raghunath Rao from the prison and said, you manage the kingdom with my brother. Tutli ayushyachi dori nahi upay. So it was his life which was terminated at a premature stage, which ended his career. Now, let me come to the writing of history. History itself stirs passions like nothing else today, and writing an unbiased history is similarly very difficult. I believe that what one writes must be shashwat. It must stand the test of time. It must stand the Agni Pariksha of the truth in history. And for that, you need to have a state of mind when you sit before your laptop and start writing the book. Now, I don't claim to be a trained historian, but the book's purpose is to put forth an honest narrative. With one writer, it is the truth as perceived by the author, after checking all the sources that he had at his disposal. Still, some subjectivity remains. Dr. Sumitra Kulkarni was the first person I met. She was a professor of history at the Pune University. And before my first book, I went and met her. And I told her, like a very innocent person, ma'am, I want to write a book that is unbiased. She told me there's nothing like unbiased in history. History is a reflection of your mind. And I'll never forget those words. I'm very grateful that you have come here today. But it helps. It helps if you're dispassionate. Because, and strangely enough, my training as a surgeon helped me in that respect. Because when I look at a patient, I look at him dispassionately. When I examine him, when I tell him what is wrong with him, when I write the clinical notes, they are all dispassionate. They are not full of emotion, because otherwise I'll be crying all the time. And we have an aphorism which reads, eyes first, hands next when you examine the patient, and tongue or writing last of all. And that helped me even in the writing of this book. So there are two things here. One, you must divorce yourself from the subject. You are just an observer. But it is even more rewarding if you can divorce yourself from yourself and your own identity. Because it's your identity which kind of brings the bias into your writing. So if you can do it, you can reduce the subjectivity in your writing, and you can examine the historical evidence and put out an honest narrative. And that has been my effort. For whatever faults are there, I'm sure all of you will find them, but it is there. The book is perhaps the longest I have written it, 576 odd pages, 32 preliminary pages. There are 32 color plates with 72 color pictures. It's got photographs of people, places, documents which have never been published so far. These have taken years to collect, and I used to say that when I write this book, I will use this document. There are several appendices, about 10 of them. There are footnotes on every page. There's an introduction to principal characters in the beginning. There are genealogies of the principal families that took part in this period. And as you go, though it's a period of only 13 years, you find, why is this book so big? As you go further ahead in the 18th century, you find the amount of information available to you keeps increasing. And you can't write about 40 years in one book. So I've tried to make it a readable book for layman. That has been one purpose, because my whole purpose is that history must go to everybody, especially people outside Maharashtra who are not necessarily reading in Marathi, and who I want to take the history of Maharashtra, because the sources in Marathi are not available to people who write in English. And the purpose of writing this is that it goes to them. Now, Pune actually lost its status as the de facto capital in early 19th century. And it lost its political leadership probably with the death of Lokmanya Tilak in the 1920s. But I still believe it has not lost its intellectual roots, and its institutions remain its strength. So niche areas of studies like the Bhandarakar Institute, the Deccan College, the Bharat Itihas Samshodak Mandal, the University of Pune Library is one of excellent library which we have, and the Gokhale Institute. These are institutes which are really the pride of Pune. The colleges of Pune, where hundreds and thousands of students come to teach, and the many intellectuals in this city. And I would not be out of place if I say that I'm very glad that intellectuals and people who have retired from public service have chosen to make, like Shri Vijay Gokhale here, have chosen to make Pune their home, because I'm sure it's a hopeful sign for the future. Coming back to the present, I'm delighted to have this book launched by Dr. Dasgupta, whom I've admired for a very long time, who is a historian by training, and one whose writing I have keenly followed, and by Shri Vijay Gokhale, who has a checkered career in the foreign ministry and remains the foremost authority we have on China. I eagerly await to hear what they have to say, and I think that will be the highlight of the evening. Thank you all for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Uday. Once more, you have taken us right back to the 17th and 18th century. Thank you. An illustrious career spanning nearly 4 decades in the Indian Foreign Service, Shri Vijay Keshav Gokhale served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia and Ambassador to Germany and the People's Republic of China. His assignments in Hong Kong, Taipei, and Beijing between 1982 and 2017, and postings at various levels in New Delhi, have given him a deep insight into Chinese politics. Shri Gokhale was present in China during the Tiananmen incident. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Shri Gokhale. In 1989, he retired as Foreign Secretary in January 2020. He has authored the books Tiananmen Square, Making of a Protest, and The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, and his latest, After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. He currently lives in Pune with his wife Vandana and devotes his time in the study of China. Please welcome Shri Vijay Gokhale.
Namaskar, ladies and gentlemen. Swapan ji, Amit ji, Dr. Kulkarni, thank you for inviting me to make my remarks on this very auspicious day when your third book in the trilogy is going to be launched. I'm sure we have all heard of the name Thomas Babington Macaulay and his famous words when he talked about shaping education in order to create, and I quote, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This was a minute that Thomas Babington Macaulay submitted to the Governor General in Council in the 1830s. And bear with me when I read some more excerpts before I come to the main point of what I want to say when I quote from Macaulay's minute. In this minute, he compares India to Egypt. He says that if a country once superior in knowledge to the European countries has now sunk far below them, allocating government monies for the study of Sanskrit would be a downright spoliation. His words, downright spoliation, in other words, throwing money down the drain literally. He then goes on to denigrate the vast body of Indian literature over the centuries by saying that nobody can deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India. And he then declares that the Indian languages are barren of useful knowledge, but fruitful of monstrous superstition. I could go endlessly on what Macaulay says. The point I want to make is Macaulay's minute on education became the policy of the British Empire in India. And what was its ultimate objective? I can't describe it better than a very famous Chinese scholar. His name was Kung Tse Chan, and he lived around the time of Thomas Babington Macaulay. And this is what he had to say. He said, to destroy a people, you must first destroy their history. And Macaulay continued to cast a huge shadow, a very long shadow, over India many years after her independence. And anecdotally, I can say that even when I was in Delhi University in 1975, that was a quarter century after we had gained our freedom, there was still an entire semester on British history. What relevance the Tudors, the Stuarts, and the Hanoverians had to India, I do not know. But a premier institution of India was still insisting that for me to get a degree for Bachelor of History from Delhi University, I needed to pass that course. And I think that says something about the writing of history. What were the British objectives in adopting Macaulay's minute on education? And to my mind, there were two. I think first of all, they wanted Indians to forget where our wealth and power had come. For the almost 1700 years that, according to a number of Western historians and economists, the Indian subcontinent was either the largest economy in terms of GDP share in the world or the second largest economy, because from roughly 1200, China and India sort of switched the first and second position fairly regularly. And the real reason they wanted to make us forget this was because our real wealth came from our maritime domain. The Indo-Gangetic plain was simply the granary that fed India. The real wealth came from Gujarat, from the Konkan, from Malabar, from Coromandel, from Bengal. And these were the spaces that the British wanted to control and capture because they had to. This was the way they could dominate world trade. And therefore they wrote history to turn Indians away from our maritime past. And the focus therefore became the history of northern India. All of us have studied the history of northern India. The south and the west merely became add-ons, attachments to history books. And it was reduced to pictorial depictions of, say, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, or a passing mention to Bajirao Ballal. And of course, the spotlight was on Maratha defeats, Panipat, the Second Anglo-Maratha War, the Third Anglo-Maratha War, and so on. This was really the first reason I think that Macaulay's policy ultimately resulted in Indians forgetting what their history was south of the Narmada. The second, of course, was that they thoroughly needed to discredit Indian capacities for self-governance, to suggest that we were so incapable of governing ourselves that we needed a benevolent foreign power to restore law and order. And they wrote to willfully create this image after the death of Aurangzeb, that India was a medley of warring states with no coherent government. And regrettably, that impression persists till today. We do believe that 18th century India was an ungovernable region. And because they did not want the real history to become public, access to the Peshwe Daftar, the thousands of documents that the Peshwas and their government in Pune had collected, was closed off. It was so tightly controlled that the British would not allow Indian historians to get to the Peshwa Daftar. And obviously this reflected a certain fear mentality in their minds. But the fact is that for more than a century after the death of Aurangzeb and the British colonization of India, there was a federally administered, highly coordinated and well-run Maratha empire that had emerged due to the efforts of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, And this fact was simply made to disappear from the public memory. In fact, the first history of the Marathas, we all know, was written by a Britisher. But perhaps less people know that this Britisher, Grant Duff, in fact participated in the destruction of the Maratha Empire. So one can only imagine what somebody who participated in the destruction of the Maratha Empire would have gone on to write about our history. And it was really only when the national awakening began at the end of the 19th century that a small group of Maratha scholars, Sane, Rajwade, of course, the founder of the Bharat Itihas Sanshodhak Mandal, Khare, Parasnis, etc., started collating the documents and manuscripts. And by the way, they were not permitted access to the Peshwa Daftar and to the Pune papers, as it was called in the British time. And ultimately, of course, you had the Bharat Itihas Sanshodhak Mandal established in Pune, and all these collective efforts led to Sardesai publishing the Marathi Riyasat. And another famous historian from Bengal at that time, Sir Jadunath Sarkar, he was to write that before this time, there was actually no Marathi history of the Marathas. It was simply British or British sponsored histories. As an aside, a former colleague of mine, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, has written a brilliant book on this period. It's called History Men, Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, Raghubir Singh and their quest for India's past, which actually outlines the efforts, at least part of the book, outlines the efforts of how the Marathi historians were able to sort of finally piece together the history of that period, the 18th century, and I would recommend that all of you read it. But despite all their efforts and the efforts of all those historians who have come after the 1950s when we became independent, as Uday tweeted some time ago, and I quote his tweet, "The ignorance of the Marathi language and thousands of Marathi letters remains. 75 years later, Indian historians still tiptoe around Maratha history." And that's a fact. If you ask an average Indian to name the Mughal emperors, at least the first 6 Mughal emperors, she or he would be able to name them, I would say, fairly easily. But if you ask them to recall the successors of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj or the first 4 Peshwas, barring Bajirao Peshwa, they would probably not recall anybody. And beyond, of course, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and perhaps Chhatrapati Shambhaji Maharaj, if they were in other parts of India, I doubt they would recall other well-known Chhatrapatis. Certainly Chhatrapati Shahu Maharaj would be far from anybody's mind. They would barely know who Mahatji Shinde was. They wouldn't remember that Yashwantrao Holkar sort of single-handedly fought the British. And this is therefore a pressing need at this point for this history of the Marathas to be known. And I think Uday Kulkarni's books, all 3 of them, we sort of unveiled the trilogy today, is doing precisely that. His books on the Marathas in the 18th century outlines this with almost visual clarity. It is a history which allows a new generation to comprehend, and this I feel very strongly about, to comprehend why Indian history must be written by Indians and from an Indian perspective. And he uses all kinds of sources, Maratha sources of course, but also British sources, Portuguese sources, Persian sources, languages that we simply can't read as ordinary Indians, the Modi script in which most of the Maratha documents are written, but also foreign languages like Portuguese. And what adds credibility to Uday's narrative is his almost obsessive desire to go and see for himself where many of these events took place. Whether they were battles, whether they were negotiations, and therefore, as our MC said, she quoted that part of the book which I also liked, that it is of course a macro history of the 18th century, but it is also a micro history of each and every event. And it brings to life the period of Madhavrao. Now, of course, all of us who grew up in the 1980s would have seen the TV serial about Madhavrao. It was called Swami. But of course, that was a highly fictionalized, romanticized account of the period. And in fact, his trials, his tribulations, the early challenges he faced even from within his own family, as Uday said, his wars with the Nizam and Hyder Ali, and increasingly the way in which he secured Maratha control over India again after Panipat was really a deserving study. before I conclude, I think the one feature I really liked about the book is that Uday brings out that the Maratha Empire is not one man. It's really a collective of men and women who come together to act. You had the Holkar family, you had the Patvardhans in the south, you had the Shindes, you had, of course, the Fadnavis cousins, Nana Fadnis and Moroba Fadnis, but you also had many people that, frankly speaking, I had not heard about. Antaji Mankekar, Trimbak Rao Pethe, Visaji Binawale, people who captured Delhi, for instance, like Ramchandra Ganesh. I had never heard that name before, Visaji Krishna. And therefore, it was rightly called the Maratha Confederacy, a federal system with the Peshwe at the nerve center and sort of the military come administrative commanders in the field. And I really wonder where anyone has done a study in political science terms, because when our current Prime Minister is now speaking again of competitive federalism, then I think the Maratha Empire is a good case study, both of the successes and failures, and perhaps there is something we can learn from this to bring to what currently we are now re-beginning the experiment of Maratha federalism. Finally, I think it's almost as if Uday has run a marathon. 570 pages, I can tell you, is quite a feat. My books do not exceed 150 pages because I die of exhaustion after that. But we certainly hope that the marathon has not dimmed the prospects of future books, because I think it is equally important that we study the reasons for the downfall of the Maratha Empire. Ultimately, the history of India might have been different if the successors to Madharao Peshwa had been different, or if people had supported Yashwantrao Holkar, for example, in the beginning of the 19th century. So at least for all of us to go ahead in the future, it is important we know the mistakes we made in the past. And with that, once again, Uday, I congratulate you on your book, and I really, really urge everybody to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shri Gokhale, for that was truly enlightening. And anything to do with the 17th and 18th century, I'm so glad Uday is bringing it out, because otherwise it's just a blank. Dr. Swapan Dasgupta was a member of the Rajya Sabha. He completed his post-graduation in history at the School of Oriental and African Studies, followed by a PhD. Dr. Dasgupta returned to India in 1986, where he began his journalistic career with The Statesman. He writes columns for English dailies, including the Indian Express, the Times of India, The Statesman, India Today, etc. Journalist, writer, and political analyst, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 2015 for his contribution to literature and education. In 2019, he published Awakening Bharat Mata, The Political Beliefs of the Indian Right. Shri Gupta was conferred an honorary visiting professorship at the Center for Media Studies at JNU in recognition of his in-depth expertise on journalism and media. He is known to be one of the most prominent center-right public intellectuals in the Indian polity. He is a prolific political writer and lives in Delhi with his wife Reshmi and son Soumya. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Swapan Dasgupta.
Namaskar. Shri Uday Kulkarni ji, Amit ji, and Mr. Vijay Gokhale, and all the distinguished people who've come to spend a very rewarding Sunday, if I may say so, talking about the 17th and 18th century. Now, you see, history is not a very popular theme in India. In the 11th century, the Arab traveler Al-Biruni said that the Hindus have no sense of history. Now, last week, without actually quoting Al-Biruni, the Prime Minister, in a small gathering where we were talking about the archives and certain private papers, more or less said our sense of recording the past is rather feeble. Whether this has got to do with the fact that in India we don't accept the conventional chronology and we look upon chronology in terms of yug rather than in terms of years and centuries is worth a thought. But the point is that indigenous writing of history is relatively recent in India. Relatively. Now, Vijay Gokhale ji was quite right in disparaging the study of British history in the Delhi University syllabus. Now, having gone through that syllabus, myself having experienced it, and having done remarkably well in the paper called British History, I have a certain vested interest in defending it. The reason for defending it is twofold. Number one, when I study modern Indian history, and much of modern Indian history has got to do with the British in India. To understand the British in India, we have to understand what the British were doing in Westminster. And I think much of the Indian history sometimes suffers from that lacuna of not knowing and not drawing the necessary connections. Especially that is true when it comes to the late 19th and early 20th century. But I find the second reason to be far more compelling. British history is one area which has got probably one of the most evolved historiography which can exist. In terms of the type of histories which have been written, British history is just marvelous. Now let me come to another slightly problematic issue. It was Uday Kulkarni's labor of love for a medical surgeon who was in the Indian Army to have moved from there at the age of 50 or so into the writing of history can only be explained by a certain degree of personal passion. And it's not a fleeting, superficial history that he's written. He's actually gone into the documents. He's actually delved into these subjects. Now, the problem I want to pose before everybody is that, and Mr. Gokhale was right in pointing out the history men which T.C.A. Raghavan has written about the wonderful tradition of Sardesai and Jadunath Sarkar and others who put forward and created this corpus of work which make up Maratha history. But that was in the 1920s and 1930s. And today, we are in the 21st century. Now, between the 1920s to 2000 and say 20 or so, how many works, significant works on Maratha history exists in India? Is this something we blame on Macaulay? Or is this something we blame on ourselves? Why? The question is why? Because Maratha history, whether you look at the Peshwai Daftars, they're one of the richest and most comprehensive collections of official documents that can exist. And this is complemented by other sources as well. You'll get sources in Baroda, you'll get sources in Gwalior, you'll get sources elsewhere, you'll get the entire Maratha Confederacy is documented, richly documented. And Udayji would be the first to admit that he hasn't even looked at some of these things. So how come when such a rich collection exists, our historians had to wait for a surgeon to actually start dabbling in history? This is the question I want to ask. This is not the first time it's happened. A friend of mine, a British friend of mine, a person called William Dalrymple, you must have heard his name or read his books, about 10 years ago, wrote a book called The Last Mughal. It's a wonderful book. I mean, those who've read it, it's extremely readable, compelling narrative, etc. The Last Mughal was based principally on certain bundles of documents which are there in the National Archives of India, which, ever since they were deposited in 1858 or so, had never been opened. So he and another person called Muhammad Farooqi, who helped him translate some of these things, were the first, after 150 years, to actually open this. And yet, when Dalrymple's book was published, the historian community of India said, this is not a book we can take seriously. I'm sure they will say the same thing about Uday Kulkarni's book. The reason for it is, there is fierce guarding of a turf. And this brings us to the larger question. Is history too important to be left to historians? I fear, in the case of India, it is certainly so. Because in India, history as a subject has got so ridiculously politicized that it has ceased to have any meaning. The reason why, from the 1920s till about 2010, Maratha history became not something which any Indian historian bothered about. I can only think of about two books, one by Andre Wink and one by Professor Richards, who actually wrote on Maratha history, and both of them were foreigners. Otherwise, it was not written. The reason for it is, it was not felt, the Maratha Confederacy was not felt to be a subject worth pursuing. And the reasons were nothing to do with the past. The reasons had everything to do with the implications for the present. And this really is the problem which is there. The overemphasis on northern India and the relative neglect of anything south of the Vindhyas, yes, part of it was a legacy of the British. But more to do with the fact that you were trying, the historians of India post-independence, were trying to project a vision of India where the Mughal Empire was central. So the choice of a subject, the choice of your grants in your universities, the choice of your PhD theses, were actually driven by these things. The over-politicization of history. Therefore, under the circumstances, I think when a book on Nana Sahib Peshwa, Baji Rao or Madhav Rao Peshwa, or subsequently anything on Chhatrapati Shivaji comes out, this is going to be seen as a challenge to a particular form of history writing. Because you're resurrecting the idea of the Maratha Confederacy. You're resurrecting the thing about what is Hindu Padpadshahi. You're resurrecting everything that Savarkar wrote at a particular point in time. Now, Savarkar's interpretation of Maratha history is something I have a personal problem with. I think he overstated the case at a lot of places. And he didn't look at some of the complexities of which was there. But nevertheless, he was a very important figure in popularizing or drawing the lessons from Maratha history into contemporary society. So I think this is going to be a very important contribution in that respect, in trying to get more and more people to unearth, to actually go learn the Modi script. Look at these Peshwa Daftars. Look at the other documents which are there. I mean, Jadunath Sarkar spent an enormous amount of time actually mastering the language. And his collaboration with Sardesai was based on this. They both complemented each other. So that rigor in terms of history writing is something we need to bring out. And I'm very glad that a very major step has been taken in this respect by Uday Kulkarni. Now let me come to another point. Whenever I'm in Europe, I always go to a bookshop or to various bookshops, mainly in the UK, because I don't know any other European language. And one of the things which I find in any good bookshop in the UK is that at least 1/3 of the books on immediate display, I mean, there are those shelves which are there for the more specialist ones, but 1/3 of the books which are on immediate display are books on some or the other aspect of history. They are written by popular writers. Very few of them are written by professional historians. Maybe one or two are. These days, more and more professional historians are actually writing popular works, especially when it comes to classical Roman Greeks. They are writing more and more popular works and getting onto television and explaining them. But by and large, these are works which are history, but are written for the lay reader. That doesn't mean they're inaccurate. But the story is told in a way which is accessible and interesting. In the way which I pointed out, Dalrymple wrote as far as The Last Mughal was concerned. It was written in a mold which is borrowed from there. And most people found it quite enthralling. One of the features which happened in India post-independence is that we had lots of controversies on history teaching, history writing, etc., books, this, that, and the other. But in the process, we killed the student interest in history. We destroyed it. We cremated it. Why? Because the books that were produced, mainly by the academic historians at that particular point, was so drearily, badly written that it was a natural cure for insomnia. The idea of narrative history. Now, I don't know how many of you still have read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's literature at its very best. It's just plain literature. It's enthralling. That is what history was supposed to be written. It had to tell a story. History is about telling a story. And Udayji shouldn't be apologetic if he also writes about an individual. Because you cannot separate these prominent individuals from a larger historical process. And there is nothing wrong in telling the story of individuals. This is a point of view which the Marxists have said the individuals don't make history. Of course they make history. And that is the point. It's a story which has to be told. And that's why Udayji's style of writing, that's the narrative history. Its narrative history is very, very important. So till we can get out of this postmodernist claptrap, till we can get out of this more modes of production rubbish, till we can get back into actually telling the story of what happened, as much as is possible. Sometimes it's not, accuracy is not always possible. Till we can get to that, India's history will remain completely inaccessible to most people. And it will suffer from distortions, it will suffer from bizarre conspiracy theories, it will suffer from all sorts of things. And to get India back to recognizing its own past, the job for both historians as well as anybody who's interested, and history does not belong to historians alone. It belongs to all of us. And it's only when that is acknowledged and we actually open up this entire vast treasure which is there, which is yet untapped, it's only then will we be able to rediscover our past. And I thank Uday Kulkarni ji for taking a very, very big stride in this endeavor. He will be remembered as someone whose labor of love contributed to that. He needn't have done it, but he's done it. And I thank you very much for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. I still remember when we were in school, our history books had the dates of Jayantis and Punyatithis, and we had to by heart all of them. At the end of the day, we didn't want to do history. So Uday's book is definitely much, much more interesting and better, and you cannot put it down, believe me. Let us felicitate Uday Kulkarni and Amit Paranjape. I request Dr. Swapan Dasgupta to felicitate Uday, please. I request Vijay Gokhale to please felicitate Amit Paranjape. Thank you, gentlemen. A diamond is considered brilliant when it has 58 facets. Shri Amit Paranjape is just such a multifaceted personality. A tech entrepreneur, his interests lie in software, science, technology, history, geopolitics, and public policy. A blogger and an active face on social media, his followers wait for his snippets of the day. He has been invited as moderator for talks with many famous personalities, the conversation becoming lively through his easy flow of the subject. Amit is an alumnus of IIT Bombay and University of Wisconsin, US. I request Amit to now steer the conversation amongst our chief guests and the author.
Okay, so I think we'll start. I have about 30 minutes. My goal is to speak very less and get as much as we can from our three excellent guests here. So let me directly start with you, Uday. You know, one of the incidents that you had mentioned, we were talking yesterday, and I'll mention this as an interesting fact that Uday's grandfather wrote a review of Sardesai's book about Madhavrao Peshwe in 1955 October, and it's very interesting that now Uday is writing about Madhavrao, following in Sardesai's footsteps. So I had to mention that nugget. But this particular book that you have written, as you mentioned, it's your longest book. How did you research this? Was it any different from some of the work that you did on your earlier books? Getting the original documents, getting the original sources, all your visits. Can you briefly talk us through that?
Actually, when I started writing about this entire period, you read a lot more than what is required for a particular book. So it's filed away somewhere, for future use. When you go and find documents, you find documents which are not relevant to that book, but which can be used in subsequent books. So many of the documents I have found and which I have used in this book have been with me for the last 9 or 10 years. And over a period of time, I have in fact, I could write 3 books during the COVID period, because before that, I had my own personal reference library on my hard disk, thanks to photographing probably 100,000 documents from various old books and so on, from various libraries like the Deccan College and the Pune University Library and so on. So I could just access, without going to the library, I could sit at home and do all that research. The original documents, some of them are from the Bharat Itihas Sanshodhak Mandal, some are from the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain, some are from the British Library. So they have been, and as the time which I write about comes up, now the next book will have some more papers which I have not published so far. So that will be used at that particular time. So this has been an ongoing process. It is in my mind that I have to write about this period, and subconsciously it kind of just gets gathered in your head. And when you start writing a particular chapter on a particular event which is going to follow, these things just come flooding in, they just come into your mind and they just come onto your laptop screen and they kind of get themselves in place. And most of the chapters I've written are usually first drafts. I very rarely have to go back and revise the draft. I mean, I give it to my son Yash, who's the first editor of the chapters, and he tells me 2 things. That is it interesting enough? Is it clearly understood? When he tells me that, I mean, all that is left is to correct the book for any grammatical or any punctuation marks and so on. So that kind of keeps adding up. Every week or 10 days, I finish 1 chapter, and that keeps getting filed gradually over a period of time. And that's a sense of continuity in your head as you're writing the story. You know what's going to come next, what's going to come probably after 4 chapters, and it's kind of there in your mind, and you're kind of subconsciously working on the whole plot of the whole region. You kind of start seeing it in your mind's eye, what is going to come next, how things have happened, what must have happened when Mallarji Holkar came here, and there's a family tiff going on of how to solve the problem of who's going to take over and the Bakhars are very interesting narratives which he gave, which of course, though they are second-rate sources rather than letters, but they give very important insights into the personalities of that time and the exact words which you used at that time. Some letters, again, there are several biases involved. I mean, so there are 2 parties in the Peshwa Darbar. So you can see, you have to discount those narratives, or at least mention a line that this guy is saying it because he is naturally antagonized towards this guy. And so, you have to put the reader back towards the center and bring him back that I'm quoting this letter, but please discount it to a certain extent, maybe by 20% of what this guy is writing, so that you don't kind of give a wrong impression about what actually the situation was. So it's just that builds upon you. Probably if I had taken up this book 10 years back when I started writing, when I wanted to write this immediately after the solstice at Panipat, it would have been a very shallow affair, because I have already read about things beyond which I have not written. So I have got a broad overview of what comes next. And now when I start writing the book, I go into the depth of each event that follows, and that kind of gradually you start building up. It's like a pyramid. You kind of keep building up. History itself is a pyramid, actually. So you start building up pieces. It's like a jigsaw puzzle which finally gets completed. And then again you add ornaments to it.
Right. So let me put you on a spot. We've also released the trilogy today, and we've all read about what Grand Duff wrote about Madhavrao. You have reproduced that quote in your book as well. about the plains of Panipat being not more fatal than the death of this young prince, essentially saying that Madharav's death was a bigger impact on the Maratha Empire than Panipat. Now that you've done this trilogy, I know it's bad to compare across generations. We talk about that in history these days. We also talk about it in cricket. But I'm going to put you on a spot. Was Madhavrao the greatest of these three?
I mean, comparisons are always, not fair, because the circumstances are different during each time. In Bajirao's time, the circumstances were different. Nana Sahib's, they were different, and Madhavrao again they were different. Or for example, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj had probably the most difficult time, because he had to fight battles against much more powerful adversaries. So it's very difficult to compare, and they all died prematurely. I mean, no Peshwa lived to be a grandfather, and they all died before the age of 40. And on the other hand, you find Aurangzeb living to his 90th lunar year. So that shows that definitely, I mean, if you suddenly cut short Bajirao as well as his brother Chimaji Appa within a period of 8 months, it's a major setback, because these were the two main doers of that empire. And Nana Sahib and Panipat both coming close on each other's, following each other, was again a double whammy kind of to the prospects of the empire. And Madhavrao, at 27.5 years of age, for this man who achieved so much actually in just 8 years, because first 3 years were literally fighting his own domestic battles. And you can imagine if he had been there, and he writes in his letters that the main threat is the English. Stop them from entering Delhi. Once they enter Delhi, it will not be possible to remove them from there. So this kind of vision, this kind of command over his armies, over his ministers, they used to be trembling when they stand before him. He used to cane them in the darbar when they come, if they misbehave themselves. So this kind of and he was the first man who really did not have to, like Chhatrapati Shahu was there in the first 10 years of Nana Sahib's time. Madhavrao was practically his own master. He didn't really have to listen to anybody else. So it was a unique period. All three are great. I mean, Madhavrao, because of the short period in which he resurrected the empire, you can say yes, he has achieved a lot. So in that respect, people call him the greatest. And besides military exploits, he is also very good at administration, which probably Nana Sahib fell short in the military compartment. So that's why, and Bajirao of course was under his sovereign. So that's why he's called the greatest Peshwa by these people.
I think that's a good perspective. I think very few people outside of Maharashtra even know about Madhavrao. And here we are talking about him. I mean, people now know a little bit about Bajirao. The fact that we are talking about he may be the greatest, and your book will definitely help in taking this story outside of Maharashtra. Swapanda, you talked about history, and after 1920 to present, especially the Maratha history hasn't even been written. But you also talked about the Delhi-centric narrative of history. What can be done, not just sitting here in Maharashtra and about the Maratha history, but overall, what can be done or what is being done to change that? I mean, for too long we have read, all of us sitting here used to always complain about it. Why are we reading so much about North? And I think people further south would probably have even stronger complaints that we never read about the Cholas in the CBSE books in any great detail. How are we fixing it, and what needs to be done?
You see, there are a couple of awkward things, let me say about this. Firstly, that despite all the importance which is been given to various Indian languages, the English language still commands a certain high degree of strategic importance. It sets the tone. Now we can say this is unfortunate, all that, but this is the reality. And one of the things about the English language is that books which are produced in the English language actually have an all India currency, if not international. Now, one of the most reassuring things which has happened in the last 15 years or so, and I trace this also to the certain mushrooming of the Indian publishing trade, is that far more books on history have started coming out, including books on South India. There are many more books coming out. And therefore, to my mind, it's not really some sort of an administrative diktat or changing the syllabus. Yes, tweaking it obviously helps. But it's really how much more is being written. That will actually set the tone. And therefore, to actually have a more balanced approach would mean that many more books on various facets of history, of Maratha history, on Vijayanagar history, on other things, over Odisha, all this is written. So I would say that it really depends on how much we can generate.
And a related question to that, and something you talked about, we clearly are not doing enough to conserve, preserve, and study the crores of documents that we have. I mean, you mentioned Peshwa Daftar, National Archives, there's so many of those. How do we fix that? How do we make history education more interesting, where young scholars will go out and, I mean, it will be a different challenge where they will face, where the bureaucracy will prevent them, but let's at least get to that challenge. Today, I don't think we even have enough people going there.
You know, one of the biggest curse for the evolution of history or historical writing has been what is called the objective type examination, which has been created in the schools and colleges. You know, year or something like that, you know. Was the French Revolution good or bad? You know. I mean, banalities like that cannot help. History is something which there is no consensus and agreement. I mean, you ask the question, who is the greatest of the Peshwas? I mean, anybody can give a very persuasive answer in different ways. So, that is one of the biggest problems. You know, we've, in this guise called evolving a scientific temper. This is one of the worst things which has been written in the Constitution, in my view. Because what we've actually emphasized is the temper, not the science. And it's at the cost of everything else. This was never the intention of anybody. The humanities has suffered grievously over the past 50 years. And I really lament this. And I think Mr. Gokhale's UPSC has much to answer from the time. The day they scrapped the essay paper, I think was a sad day.
No, I think I'll avoid that question, but let me come to an interesting question that is related to what Shri Vijay Gokhale has practiced for 40 years. Very effectively for our country, and that is diplomacy and foreign policy. And I'll put that question in the context of Madhavrao. And if you look at the book, especially the first half of the book, there's so much of back and forth between the Nizam and Hyder Ali. And there are multiple battles, but and there are going to be follow-up questions from me for you as well, Uday, on that. But forget the battles part. But multiple times there are some victories and then there are some negotiations. And then they break down after a few years. Then there are treaties favorable to one party, not favorable to the other party, and so on. How would you analyze that from a 21st century standpoint? How do you look at that diplomacy and negotiations? Because they're essentially two different powers dealing with each other. And how do you rate Madhavrao and Nana Fadnis, who was doing some of the background work there as well?
Yeah, you know, I can be heard, I suppose. I can really relate to a lot of that aspect of the book, because it shows that diplomacy is not black and white. And even today, when we engage in diplomacy and you have armchair critics saying, why didn't we get everything? They don't understand that there are different powers operating at different levels, and that negotiation is all about, at the end of it, compromise with the ability to walk away with the advantage. It is not to completely vanquish the other side, so that, because we know from history, from the Treaty of Versailles, for instance, in 1919, that if you vanquish the other side so completely, the other side will come back to bite you sooner rather than later. And therefore, I think a much more important thing is how can we study Indian history from the perspective of learning about negotiation. I have to say that we are very poor negotiators. Firstly, of course, because we never prepare for a negotiation, but also because we don't understand the nuance. Negotiating with the Nizam was very different from negotiating with Hyder Ali. You can't have the same set of people with the same mindset doing the same negotiation, but regrettably, even today in the 21st century, the same mindset, the same individuals, and the same negotiating strategy is put forward whether you're doing a trade negotiation with the Americans or a border negotiation with China. And therefore, these sort of books, I think, are valuable not only for all of us to know what Madhavrao did, but for students of international relations and political science to work on the theories of negotiation. And the fact is that throughout Indian history, there have been some remarkable periods when we were able to negotiate from positions of relative adversity. May I add one word about your the question that you asked Dr. Dasgupta? It's not just history that we seem to give a low level of importance to, it's culture also. As the Foreign Secretary, and this is the honest truth, when we were asked to reduce budgets, once you've cut out the chai and the samosa and the pune, the next thing you go for is the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. You start cutting funding for them, you don't want cultural troops to go abroad, you don't want research to be done, because the average view of somebody in the government is, this is a waste of money. Why should you actually fund somebody to go into a Bharatnatyam dance abroad or access an archive abroad which might tell you in the 16th century that some king or some government did? And that's a mindset which hasn't changed. And really that needs to change. When that changes, writing of history and appreciation of history will be much greater.
That's a very important point because, I mean, we didn't touch upon that topic, but whether it's museums, whether it's the monuments, the heritage structures we have, the amount of attention we pay to them is, I mean, everyone knows what it is. Again, my favorite pet peeve there is ASI is way too Delhi-centric. It's only 4 or 5 monuments in and around Delhi.
The problem with ASI is that it's too IAS-centric.
Yeah, I think, but let's not get into that discussion. That's a whole separate topic. But continuing with this negotiation and diplomacy thread, Vijayji, I'll ask you about the English as well. Madhavrao versus the English it's just the start of a major Indian power dealing with the English. And Uday has a very nice, well, not quote, his line in the book where he says that, you know, and I forgot, I should have written it down verbatim, but it basically says the English were lucky. I mean, they didn't realize that they are going to get such a great opportunity. And once they saw it, they pounced on it. But this when Madhavrao was very strong. So how was he looking at the English threat and how was his diplomatic calculations with them? Because he did need them for some cases as well.
You know, let me make a comparison between what I consider is the modern, because the English were master diplomatists. I think now Singapore has taken that role. And if you look at it, this tiny country in Southeast Asia has leveraged its city-state to exercise an influence which is throughout the Far East. From Japan to India, you want Singapore on your side. And I think that's really the mastery that the British brought in terms of diplomacy, despite being a relatively weak power at that time, at the time of Madhavrao, because of course the Nizam, Hyder Ali, Shuja-ud-Dawla and others were much more powerful. They could leverage this, their weakness, because of their capacity to deal with multiple players for advantage. And I think the stronger power very often tends to disregard because they have all the capabilities at their disposal, so they think that they can deal with that marginal power at their will. It of course never works that way, as we have seen recently with the Americans also in Afghanistan. Ultimately, the Taliban did manage to beat the Americans. So I think really that is where perhaps not just the Maratha Empire, but even the other Indian rulers went wrong in assuming that the British could be manipulated, and because they were not in that sense a military power, that they could be used against the other. Of course, ultimately you do make common cause with your adversary if it is necessary, and we have done so in the past. The fact is, even independent India has done so in the past. But you cannot, of course, let your guard down, and I think that is what happened with the Marathas after Madhavrao. They let their guard down. Treaties to keep the subsequent Peshwas in power, that all added to eventually eroding Maratha influence.
Hello? Yeah. Uday, let me come back to you. One area that you briefly mentioned, but we didn't get a chance to discuss in detail, so I'll come back to that, is Madhavrao's focus on administration and his perpetual headaches. I mean, this is a problem that affected all the Peshwas in the 18th century, but particularly Madhavrao, and that is debt. And there's a lot of letters that you have produced where he's talking to his team about recovery of money and the debts that are piling up. You can say that Panipat was one reason for the debt, but why was this so prominent, especially in the Maratha history? And were they just not good at collecting funds? Were they not good at financial management? Because he did have great people like Nana Fadnis and all managing administration. So why was this such a central issue?
Part of it is because it's actually in a book in Nana Sahib Peshwa, it's mentioned in a little more detail. Because the revenue was collected by the several states, outlying states, and they were remitted to Pune. Now this is a very interesting and very, I would say a piece of Marathi literature. It's one of the very, very good pieces, where he writes a letter to his friend Nana Purandare, and he laments that, in fact it's very high level Marathi, to really translate it for the book was also very difficult. He says that the Suvarna Ganga of the north and the Suvarna Ganga of the south had been flowing into the kingdom and reaching Pune. But these days, the land on the way is very arid, and much of that water seeps into the soil and very little reaches Pune. Now the buck stops here was the situation. The Peshwa had to raise the armies and go out and fight. He had to pay their salaries. But the money was not coming. Though he had his Fadnis and his financial people in all these darbars, it was always a tug of war trying to get the money to actually come to Pune, to reach Pune. And the chiefs over there would say, but I have already spent so much on this campaign and you are not paying me for it, and the money recovered here has been insufficient for that purpose. Abdali has just come and ravaged the entire territory. There is no money to be found. How will you make do with expenses? So this, the entire Maratha period you will find was a period of military expansion and military campaigns. It's only between 1783 and 1792 or 93 that the Marathas had respite from war, but even then they were fighting with Tipu till 1787-88, because they finished the first Anglo-Maratha war. They had a battle with Tipu Sultan going on, but finally that was and I would call that was the Maratha cultural renaissance, which in my book.
And we see some of that in the James Wills.
Yes. So they never had that respite. I mean, you don't see those magnificent buildings you see in the rest of the country where the Raja Maharajas, they never had that respite. There was always a military campaign which they had to face. Being in the center of the country, they had adversaries to the east, to the west, and the south, and the north. And they had to face them all at the same time. Armies were going north, armies were going south, armies were going east. Domestic enemies, suppose the Bhosles don't get along with the Peshwas, he had to put that also down, because he would otherwise collaborate with the English. So these problems required money, and that money was not always easy to generate. I find Nana Sahib Peshwa in the last years of his life, when Panipat happened, he was raising funds at 2 rupees a month or 2% a month. That was the rate of interest he was paying from money lenders to get money from them. So this perpetual shortage, at the same time the responsibility lay with them. The buck stopped there. The main change which took place in Chhatrapati Shahu's time was that the Peshwa had to not only look after the king's needs, but he had to look after the kingdom's needs, for which he had to depend on his sardars, and the sardars did not always faithfully remit the money to him, and therefore he was the man always in spot. All the Peshwas, when they died, they always had several lakh of rupees as debts, personal as well as public debts. So this is kind of a circumstance which happened. I mean, we cannot question why it happened. It was the way it would be. Everybody wants to conserve his own funds.
Right. Hello. Yeah. Swapanda, you briefly talked about it, and we were talking about it last night as well. History can be very boring if it's reproduced as it is. It's interesting if it's written a little bit like how Uday writes it. But then there are other schools of thought today where they write history like fiction. I mean, they take few real incidents, few historical facts, but then they write, and there was a reference, I think Mr. Gokhale mentioned about the serial Swami. And that entire serial was very popular. It was about Madhavrao and his wife Ramabai. And if you read Uday's book, the reference to Ramabai is significantly small than what that series. Same is the case with Bajirao Mastani. So my point is, but that on the other hand, the popularity of that was probably many times more than Uday's books. That was a reality. So where do you draw the line? How should history be written to make it interesting yet faithful?
No, see, historical fiction. There exists a genre of writing which is historical fiction. I mean, if people who are interested in romance might have read Georgette Hare. That's probably the classic example of historical fiction. But a lot of people have written historical fiction, and they're quite nice in its own right. But that is not history. And I think it's quite self-evident that it's not history. But what it does tell you is that it's possible to actually capture the reader's attention by writing history. The possibilities of reading. A good biography doesn't have to be a dreary work. I don't know if any of you have read the 3 volumes Isaac Deutscher wrote on Trotsky. It's one of the most beautiful biographies which have been written. Again, he was not a professional historian. And it seems mainly non-professional historians have done it. The only... they were historians. They were historians, But by and large, this is the case. So let's just... I don't think Amish can be accused of writing history.
But he's very popular.
He is very popular.
What about Dalrymple?
But I think Dalrymple is quite rigorous and quite faithful to documentation as far as I'm concerned. You can fault him on interpretation. Like, I would say that one of the biggest shortcomings of the entire Maratha Confederacy was that they never had any vision of empire. Which is why this whole issue of money plagued them all the time. Because every region was inherently unstable. Because it was not drawn in to the larger system.
So I think we have 5 more minutes. So I'm going to get one quick question from Vijay, and then last question for Uday. So I know what ifs are very, very tough, and but history is about what ifs. And I'll just quote a very interesting what if that Dr. Jayan Naralekar wrote many years back. It's available online. It's not published in a book. But it's a short story of about 30-40 pages. And that what if you haven't read, just Google, you'll find it. It's about the bullet that struck Vishwas Rao, Mrs. Vishwas Rao. Vishwas Rao survives, Sadashiv Rao survives, and Marathas win Panipat, and how the entire history changes after that. It's an interesting, and it's about his science, it's about theory of parallel universe, and he sort of puts in. So I'm going to ask you, what if Madhavrao had lived till 70?
Well, I can't speculate as to what would happen if he had lived till 70, but even after Madhavrao, there were times when the situation could have been turned around. Yashwantrao Holkar in from 1800 to 1815 was fighting the British, sometimes single-handedly. Other Maratha Sardars did not come to his help. And in 1857 also we know that during the mutiny, the fact of the matter is that, of course, the Maharaja of Gwalior was a minor, but Gwalior shut the doors. And if Gwalior had turned in 1857, we don't know what the state of that war of independence or mutiny would have been. So, in a sense, we also did harm to ourselves. And I think the message in all this is that we should understand that while the motto unity in diversity is important, the unity part is also important. You can't just stress on the diversity part. There is an essential unity that India has built now, and that helps preserve our independence. And I think that is important.
Just a small footnote in this, and I think Uday's book is very important, that the earlier chapters on Madhavrao Peshwa is got to do with the mysterious disappearance or death of Bhav in Panipat, and how that rumor keeps going. It's sort of Netaji phenomena, you know. Now, I think that's a very interesting subject too. What was he being sought after as the culprit of Panipat, or was he being sought after as the person who would rescue the Confederacy from the devastation of Panipat? I think it's worth another thing. My own feeling is that he was a terrible strategist. That Panipat was always due to his failure and inability to make the strategic alliances at certain points. But I'm sure there could be another explanation.
Yeah, I think we should get Swapanda back in Pune for discussion on the earlier books of Uday as well. So
Answer to you would be a very long-winded one.
I know. But I think let me come to the last question. I think something I tweeted yesterday when someone had asked about a question about the first Anglo-Maratha war or something like that. I forgot the exact question, but my answer was wait for Uday's next book in 2024. So my last question to Uday is, what's next?
The next book is still a gleam in the eye, if you understand what I mean. But I think it should take a year and a half to 2 years. And of course, I'll carry on the narrative further because the next period would probably start from January 1773 and go on till January 1783. To 10 years period, because you have to have a natural kind of conclusion for a period.
So that will cover the first Anglo-Maratha war, the Salbai.
That will cover start from Narayan Rao Peshwa's reign to the end of the Anglo-Maratha war, the Treaty of Salbai.
Great. So we have all your fans. We have something to look forward to. But I hope before that all of you finish this 600-page book. Highly recommended. And for those who haven't, do look at the trilogy as well. It's a nice combination.
Next book release, I'm going to put a question there. Only those who pass can come in.
And again, all the books are available for sale outside. Uday is going to sign them here if you get them here. So with that, I'm going to close this panel. Thank you very much, Swapanda, for coming here. It was great to meet you. Thanks, Vijay. And over to you.
Like the beginning of a program, the end too is time-bound. Although the stimulating conversation could go on, we need to unfortunately draw the curtains on it. Thank you, gentlemen. I now request Dr. Uday Kulkarni to propose the vote of thanks.
Before I start with the vote of thanks, there's a very important felicitation to be done, and that is of Mohini Karkarey. She has not been properly introduced, I feel, and this is the time for me to do it. That she is a descendant of the Peshwa family, and it is very nice of her and kind of her to come here and perform this duty of anchoring this show. And I would request Dr. Dasgupta to please felicitate her. It's nice to see everybody seated at the vote of thanks. It's a great pleasure that I stand before you to propose this vote of thanks for the people who helped create the book and to make today's event possible. To begin with, I start with thanking our chief guests, Shri Vijay Gokhale and Dr Swapan Dasgupta, for agreeing to grace this occasion and launch the book formally. Shri Vijay Gokhale, I must compliment for reading the entire book in 3 days. That was indeed the first encouraging feedback I had about the book. Thank you. Swapanji, to my surprise, when I invited him, I found was familiar with my earlier books and had read some of them. And that kind of gave me a kind of a lift up when I invited him and he agreed immediately. I really appreciate the time and the effort you have taken. Fly down to Pune and give us a talk. And your impressions and your inputs are really something which are eye-opening and only a historian could have done that. Thank you, Swapanji. And as Amit said, we really hope to have you in Pune more often. Amit Paranjape has been a friend for the last 12 years since my first book and traveled this journey with me. He has been encouraging me to keep writing. Periodically, he keeps sending me a message, Kiti za lihun zalo. So I tell him I have reached till this year. So that's how he goes. He's a man of many parts, as you heard Mohini introduce him. And he's now also an expert interlocutor who understands history and is a pleasure to talk to. There are 3 people who are not amongst us today, and I cannot finish the vote of thanks without remembering them. One is Padma Vibhushan Shiv Shahir Baba Saheb Purandare, who passed away just before he completed his 100th year. And it was at his hands that I could launch the first 2 of my books, and I consider myself very fortunate for that. He was indeed a father figure to all historians in Maharashtra, and though he may not be with us, his Shiva Srishti, which is coming up, will always remind us of his work. The second person I would like to remember today is Shiva Bhushan Ninad Bedekar, who guided me on my journey in the early days. And the third person who I miss today is Sujit Patwardhan. I began getting my books printed at Mudra, which was his press in Narayanpet, and his passing away earlier this year was a big loss. But 2 years back, he had closed down his press, and the people whom he trained, Yogesh Dabhade of Sri Mudra and Rohini, who handles the technical side of composing the book, have helped me to bring out the books in the last 2.5 years. These people are incredibly hardworking, they are extremely reliable, and I owe them a big thank you. Again, all my books have been copy edited so far by Sonia Khare, and she has been a sounding board throughout the writing of the book. Every chapter goes, she gives me a feedback. How is it? Should I change certain things? Is it interesting enough? Is it readable? Is there a sense of continuity? So in that, she has been a great asset during the writing of this book also. My son Yash, of course, reads the first draft of every chapter. Dr. Abhinav Kurkute, I don't know if he's here today, of Deccan College, he did the maps for this book. In fact, it's the first time I entirely delegated the map making to somebody else. All these days I was doing it myself, but as far as time I start reducing some of my work, and he's done a really good job of it. I'm sure you'll find the difference between my earlier maps and his maps which were there this time. So many have helped me again with bits and pieces of material that have gone into this book. Dr. Vijay Bape, who has translated my books into Marathi, he read this manuscript before it was printed and he gave me his feedback about the book. And this beautiful backdrop which you see here on the stage is courtesy Western Australia flags. And Anuradha, I think she's here. Thanks a lot for bringing it all the way from Perth here. And it's really graced the stage. It's looking so beautiful. Thanks a lot. The excellent Nandi or Ganesh Vandana, which we saw in the beginning, was choreographed by Dr. Anjali Raju of Samarchana. It's a dance school in Pune. And I'm sure all of you appreciated that start. I'm grateful to Aparna Kare, who is a trained musician. Unfortunately, she's not here today. But she recorded the national song for me, which we will hear after this vote of thanks. I must finally also thank Sahil Dev, who is not here, but who has largely remained in the background, along with his friends Indranil Chitare and Surendra Pathare for their help in coordinating the program. The Palki once again is thanks to Mohini, who has provided her family artifacts for preparing this beautiful Palki here. And she, this anchoring of the program, of course, she has taken it upon herself as a kind of a tribute to Madhavrao from her side. So grateful thanks, Mohini. Rashmin Kulkarni, a history buff, who was with Swapanji some time back from when he came here. And Ram and Santosh, who helped bring the Palki here. And Janardhan, who played that wonderful piece on the tutari, I will not, that added a new facet to the book launch. Amit Paranjape, who I think you should turn the video on to yourself, has done an excellent job. He shot all my book launches for the last 12 years and done an excellent job each time. Again, I'm grateful to SP College, Shikshan Prasarak Mandali, Shri Mandar Upasni, who is the secretary of the Mandal, and Prashant and his staff, who have been so helpful in arranging all the things at this place, and the very distinctive audience who has chosen to spend a Sunday morning with me. And again, to those who read and those who buy my books, which allows me the luxury of keeping on writing, and a big thank you to all of you. Before I hand over the mic to Mohini, I think we'll have to, the Vande Mataram will be after. And as we say in the armed forces, let's end with Jai Hind. Thank you.
The books are available for sale at the entrance and they will be signed by Dr. Uday Kulkarni. This concludes our book launch. I request Uday Kulkarni and Amit Paranjape to kindly escort the dignitaries from the stage. Thank you.